so far we've talked about lots of different things for creating your photos. Uh, Talked about lots of technical terms. We've talked about composition. We talked about exposure, about light. And now we're going to talk about lenses. And why do we talk about lenses? Well, just like everything else, what we're doing is building a group of ingredients, a list of different elements that you can include in your photos to tell the kind of story that you want to tell. So, how do lenses do that? Well, lenses do that in a variety of ways, and like this. Here's a variety of lenses. These are this is a image of Canon lenses. I'm not sure if it's still current, but it's not far off from that. There's a lot of lenses, lots and lots of lenses. So why do what's the importance of lenses? Well, if you think about it, the lens is what's between you, the subject, and the image sensor. So what goes on in here is just as important as everything that's happening in your camera body itself. It's the eye of your camera. Without this, or if this is not good, you'll get technically poor images. If this is poor quality or doesn't do what you want or fights how you like to take photos, you will likely not feel compelled to make interesting photos. So it all goes together. Now, here's something to be aware of with lenses. If you get, as you get more experience with photography, and hopefully as you get deeper into it and find you really, really enjoy it, and you buy a camera if you don't already have one, you will discover that these things, lenses, will be surprisingly expensive. Once you get used to it, it's not too bad. But man, the first time you go into a camera store and find out, what? It's not $100, it's $1,000? It's how much? $2,000? Yeah, it's pretty rare for lenses to be good ones anyway, to be under $300-400. They're usually multiple $100s, and the really, really good ones, and I'll talk about a little bit what makes them really, really good later, can be several $1,000s. So it's a lot of money. It's really easy to have more money into your lenses than you have in your individual camera body. So as you're thinking about lenses, here's some general things to be aware of. There's lenses for just about any kind of purpose you could want to take a picture for. So there's special purpose lenses for seeing things up close, special purpose lenses for seeing things wide, underwater lenses, lenses for telescope, lenses to do lots of general purpose things, and everything in between at all kinds of various quality levels. One of the cool things about lenses, and even, yes, they're expensive. Yes, they're expensive. No way around that. Is the investment you spend on these will not become outdated very quickly, if maybe even ever. Because the physics, the optics, physics of optics, the way light works, doesn't change. Lenses today are all manufactured to very high quality standards. Much of the process is automated except for the final assembly. So you get really good, consistent quality. So that means this lens will last me 20, 30 years, maybe longer. I probably will not be using this camera in 20 or 30 years because a newer, better one, because there's more advancements more rapidly here in the camera itself, in the sensor, in the focusing systems, all the ways that the magic happens in this black box will change more rapidly than here. So as one of the things if you are ever considering buying a camera, see what your friends have. That'll maybe help you make your decision. If your friends have Canon, you might consider Canon because maybe you can borrow their lenses, because a Canon lens won't fit on a Nikon, won't fit on a Sony, won't fit on a Fuji, won't fit on a Panasonic. There's adapters, but they're clunky. Oftentimes they don't work very well. So think about that. Also, in addition to potentially borrowing gear, one of the advantages of considering getting camera gear that's similar to someone you know is they can be a tutor. They can help you learn how to use the system. There are no bad cameras now. If you go buy a new camera in a camera store, they're all good. I think I mentioned this. Yeah, so they're all good. It's just a matter of, does it do what you need? And there's no perfect cameras, so be aware of that. So you have good and perfect's over here, and some cameras stop somewhere short of perfect, all of them. So we're talking about lenses, though. Lenses, lenses, lenses. Let's talk about how we specify how we talk about lenses. So when you're talking about lenses, we'll talk about focal length, and I'll tell you about what that is next slide, and then the maximum aperture. So this lens, let me take the cap off, sorry. This lens is a 35 millimeter, that's the focal length, and it's an f2. It will also go, you can see this one. Where are we? Come on, there we are. It's f2, 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, 8, 11, and then 16. So it does have all the aperture ranges there, but the maximum, that's the one we kind of care about because that'll tell me how much light maximum the lens will let in. So the smallest number. So when I talk about lenses, I'll say the 35 f2 or the 30, yeah, something like that. I may not even say the millimeter part. Sometimes that's how it goes. Okay, sorry, got distracted by my lens. All right, so let's talk about each of these, at least the focal length part next. So focal length, what that is, it gives you a sense of what the lens sees. Does it see a lot? Do I see the whole room, or do I just see part of it or somewhere in the middle? So focal length gives you a sense of that. It's not purely descriptive, but it does give you an idea of what's going on. So with focal length, we measure that. The dimension of focal length is measured in millimeters. And here's a general rule of thumb of how they work. So the smaller numbers will be, we call those wide angle. I'm going to show you examples of each of these in a moment. So in the low teens to the 30s. Now I'm going to pause here for just a minute. There's a little math involved here in that all right, remember back when we were talking about camera basics, just pretend you do remember that. There are, for the most part, two sensor sizes with cameras like this. This is called a crop sensor, which means the sensor is smaller than the traditional 35 millimeter piece of film. And there's full frame sensors, which are the same size approximately as the 35 millimeter piece of film. So these numbers that I'm showing you here on screen are referenced to how it would render an image on a 35 millimeter sensor. And if you're dealing with a crop sensor, you also have to crop the focal length to get the equivalent. I'm not going to have you do that in this class, but it's math that I do in my head now. So for example, this is a 10 to 24 on my crop, which would be, I multiply by 1.5, that's the crop factor on this camera and most crop sensor cameras. So I multiply 10 by 1.5, that gives me 15, and I multiply 24 by 1.5, and that gives me 36. So this, if it was going to be the same field of view as what was on a larger sensor, it would be equivalent to what's 15 to 36 millimeters. Sorry, I hope that didn't confuse you. Don't stress about it. I just wanted to put the information out there because if you're reading about photography stuff online, or, well, there's still a couple magazines left, not many, or on a YouTube channel, and someone says crop factor, that's what they mean. So basically it's, here's my sensor for 35, and then it's smaller, so the lens covers less area. So it's basically like you have a smaller box, you've cropped your field of view. It doesn't magnify it, mostly, but it does show you less. Okay, sorry to confuse. All right, then we have the middle numbers, which are kind of called the standard field of view. Standard lenses, that's somewhere between 35-ish and 85-ish, with kind of 50 being the general standard kind of lens. And that broadly mimics what you see in your main part of your field of view. So that's very similar to what, if you were standing there looking at something, that's what it would look like. And then we get to larger numbers, any 100 to 400 plus. There are some 800 and 1200 millimeter lenses. They're, as you might imagine, crazy huge. They're basically telescopes and crazy expensive. That's called telephoto. So that has a smaller field of view, and I trade off for that smaller field of view by getting closer to my subject, even though I didn't move. So those are the basic numbers. Let's talk about how they tell stories. Just like we can tell stories with color, quality, quantity, direction of light, and composition and subject, we can also tell stories with our lenses because they kind of go with composition oftentimes. So let's start with wide angle lenses. So wide angle lenses, as I mentioned earlier, are about 10 millimeters to 30 millimeters-ish. There are some 8-ish, 9-ish in full crop sensor land, but 10 is about the smallest you're going to see. If you get any smaller than that, they tend to be what's called a fisheye lens, which means they have a circular field of view, but they're really, really wide. So wide angle lenses show more of the scene. You can see the same, more of the stuff. It's like you backed up, basically, but you don't have to back up because the lens is doing that work for you. It's got a wider field of view. Think about the wide angle lens in your car, not the backup camera, but the passenger side mirror is a wide angle lens. It says on it, objects in mirror may be closer than they appear. It's showing more, and the way it shows more is makes everything a little smaller. One of the things that happens as you do this is it tends to exaggerate sizes and shapes of things that are closer to those edges. So I'll show you some examples in some photos, but if you put a wide angle lens up close to someone when you're taking their picture, their head kind of tends to become a balloon shape, and it's not very flattering. It tends to make objects look like they're farther apart than they actually are. So it kind of exaggerates that distance of things. So again, if you want to tell stories and make things feel like, oh, they're so lonely and so far apart, you can use a wide angle lens to do that, even though they might be relatively close together. Storytelling. See, cameras don't always tell the truth, hardly ever tell exactly the truth. We get to choose the stories. They tend to have a deeper depth of field, so they'll have more in focus. At any given aperture size, the wide angle lenses will have more in focus. So if I had a wide angle lens at, let's say, 5.6, it would have more in focus, depth of field, than, let's say, a 200 millimeter would at 5.6 and have less in focus. Fun. Depth of field. Remember I told you back on exposure day, that's the most complicated part of understanding what's going to happen next. And a neat thing about these kind of lenses is because they're different than what you and I see with our normal vision, they can give you a very dramatic point of view. Especially if you place them down low on tall things, things get very dramatic, or if you're up high and above things, you can do some really cool stuff and tell stories, have emotional content beyond just, here's a picture of a tree. If you take a wide angle lens down low and look straight up a tree, now it's all of a sudden this giant, even if it's not a very big tree. Really fun stuff. So here's some examples of some wide angle photos. So this is in the Museum of Flight. Looking in their, I think they call it the Grand Gallery, something like that. The reason the people are blurry is because this is a 30-second exposure. So anybody who is moving tends to disappear. And if they were just moving a little bit during that time, they're kind of ghosty. Anyway, so we get to see a large scene, a big bit of the scene of the room. So we can take it all in with one photo. Here's some buildings in London. Just looking up, straight up between a few buildings, so you get this very dramatic perspective. Again, you might look up a little bit as you're wandering around with buildings, but you hardly ever look straight up. Well, maybe you do. And if you do, I hope you have a camera in your hand because it makes for a really, really cool photo. Wide angle lenses are lots and lots of times used for landscape. So sometimes students will ask, what should I use? What lens should I use for a landscape? What should I use for portrait? What should I use for weddings? What should I use for, whatever? And there's no right answer to that, at least in my opinion. If you use a lens for the thing, then it's that kind of lens. But landscapes tend to be, big, large scenes that we want to see it all. And so wide angle lenses, which show lots, tend to be great for that. Yeah. A common use for wide angle lenses is interiors, so like for real estate. Here's a picture of my office after I painted that dark wall and rearranged things. My desk is a total mess now compared to this. It was nice and clean. But my office is not a large room. It's a little less than 8 by 10. But this makes it feel a little bigger. But look at the exaggeration and distortion of shapes, especially on the right-hand side. That edge where I have my clock is a circle, it's not an oval. That puzzle that's Marvin the Martian Invaders puzzle above my desk, it looks kind of like a square. It's a rectangle. So again, wide angle lenses, especially around the edges, can distort shapes. So just be aware of that. It could be a cool effect, but be aware that it's there. Stories, wide angle lenses can make things feel grand and give a sense of a big picture, because you see lots and lots of detail, not lots of detail, you see lots of elements and you can see all of them. It's the big picture. So that's wide angle. Then we get to our standard lenses, which are approximately 35 to 85 millimeters. These kind of lenses are pretty good at showing the same field of view as if you're standing there looking at something. And you look at your main field of view, which is about the width of your shoulders. So right about here is my main view. Anything outside of that is what's called peripheral. So I can see my hands wiggling, but I have to in order to see details, I have to turn or move my eyes. That's peripheral. So it's approximately that same field of view. So this is really good for documentary type things that I want to show, if you were there, this is how it would have looked to you. So it's really good for that kind of stuff. It was often used for journalism, reporting the facts, because there's relatively little distortion of any kind with this kind of lens. So distances between objects also feel approximately the same. Depth of field tends to be shallower at any given aperture than a wide angle, but it's still not all that much different necessarily than our eyes. And tells accuracy also in distance between objects, relationship in space between objects and each other. Where a wide angle lens will exaggerate that distance, a standard lens will pretty much say, you get a sense of how close things really are. And then lastly, let's take a look at some photos. So these can be great if someone says a portrait lens, that they might be talking about one of these. So this is from a wedding a while back. Here's kind of a documentary photo I was taking in the library at Highline. I wanted to, I have a sequence of these photos of just individuals in spaces made for more than one person, but which tells the story to me of, even though being a student now is different than it was 6 months ago or a year ago, depending on when you're watching this video. Being a student is seen sometimes as a community activity, but in the end, it's solo. It's you. It's alone. You have to do the work, and you have to deal with your stress and your schedule and everything else. So I wanted to take some pictures that showed that. Another student life photo at Highline. Just a lone student walking on campus. And these camera lenses obviously can be used for landscape. Here's a landscape photo. This is Sammamish looking at Bellevue there. So there's Bellevue. Or is that? Oh wait, is that Bellevue or that's Seattle actually? Sorry. Yeah, so if you take a picture of landscape with a lens, whatever lens you're using is now a landscape lens. So no limits on what you can do. And then we get to telephoto. These lenses are 100 millimeters or more. So that means your field of view is now getting smaller. You're seeing less, but it's like you're getting closer to your subject. So that can be kind of fun. We'll talk about the advantages. So we get to see less, but it's magnified. And this is opposite of wide angle. So where wide angle makes things look farther apart, telephoto will tend to compress things. Recently in the news here, there was, again, depending on when you're watching this, I think it was been in, let's say, May of 2020, when there was some reopening after the COVID-19 shutdowns. They showed how close people were standing together, and most of it was done with a lens. Because if you take a telephoto lens and you take a picture of someone standing behind someone else, they're going to look like they're closer together than they really are. So if you have 100 people that are 6 feet apart, they're going to look like they're, if you have the right telephoto lens and right perspective, you can make them look like they're standing front to back. Storytelling, editorial, not documentary. They tend to have the least depth of field, so the least amount in focus from front to back of any of the types of lenses, so that's a property to be aware of. Again, this can be dramatic because it shows you things differently than the way you normally see it. The way I often use telephoto lenses is to isolate, so to show one thing and exclude everything else. You can do lots of different things, but that's the thing I tend to do. So let me give an example of that. When I was showing you wide angle photo, the first photo I showed you was in the Museum of Flight. Here's a picture of just one of the planes from that same scene. So this is the Blackbird. All you see is the Blackbird. You saw what was else in that photo, what else is right around it, but this is just the Blackbird. I really like this type of photography, kind of minimal, simple. So one of the things you'll discover as you're working with lenses and experimenting with things is you'll discover, hey, I tend to take photos with this focal length or this type of lens. And that becomes an important clue in how you like to take photos. And if you want to mix things up, like I tend to shoot a lot like this. So for me to mix things up is to go wide angle, to go wide angle or to go normal, to go standard. So to put a standard lens on feels different for me. Here's a profile photo for Kate here. She wanted a new LinkedIn profile photo. And again, this is a telephoto lens, so I'm probably 6-8 feet away from her, and she's isolated against the background. The background is blurry, so there's no detail back there. So it isolates the subject from the surroundings. Same thing here at the wedding at Natalie with her dance with her dad. I got another wedding tear. I love them. And you can tell there's guests at the wedding, but the details are blurred. You can tell there's a flower in the front, a bouquet, but it's blurred. Even the DJ speaker is blurred, thank goodness, because it's not super attractive. So you get the details of the things you want, and then everything else that's not in focus will tend to be a nice blurry blob. So isolating. Here with the Blue Angels, Lieutenant Commander Andre Webb, after he's done with his flight, a little sweaty. Nice tight close-up here. Yeah, so I love doing this. The trees behind are just, again, blurry. You don't see details. So it really tells the story of this pilot in his Blue Angels plane. So think about the kind of stories you prefer telling and the way you like to tell stories. Do you like big pictures? Do you like facts and kind of this is the way it really was? Or do you like intimate close-up details and stories? Lenses are a big part of that. Our nice thing is our phones oftentimes now will have up to 3 lenses. So you'll have a wide angle, a standard, and a short telephoto lens. So you can even start doing that on your phones now by choosing the different lenses. And when you get into stuff like this is only some of my lenses. I have 4, 2, 3, 4 more, I think. So yeah, stories, fun. Let me show you another example of how this changes the story with your lenses. I'll show you that in just. All right, so I'm back. You're back. Maybe you never went anywhere. I thought the ice cream truck was gone. I even did office hours, and but it just came back. So we may have to enjoy the strains of The Entertainer from the movie Sting. Look it up, kids. All right. We were talking about lenses, and we still are. So one of the things I want to show you next is how different lenses look on a subject. For example, let's look at a portrait. I'm going to show you photos of my wife, Debbie, at different focal lengths. So I'm going to change the field of view of the lens. And what I'm going to do in each sequence of photos is I'm going to take a picture that's basically from the top of her head to kind of mid-chest. So it's what I'll call a profile photo kind of photo. And to do that, what I'll do is I'll start at 18 millimeters, which is wide angle. So I'll be pretty close to her. And then I'll back up with each focal length increase, so I'm getting more telephoto until eventually I'm about 5, 6 feet away from her. So let's get started with the first photo and watch how things look. So in this first photo, I'm pretty close to Debbie, and her head is a little more exaggerated in roundness than it usually is. Also, her nose looks a little bigger. Her eyes look farther back in her head. Remember what I said about wide-angle lenses, especially as you're either close to your subject or the subject is close to the edge of the frame, is going to distort shapes and relationship of distances. So let's get off this photo, go to the next one. So here's 35 millimeters. So it's kind of in that somewhat standard focal length range. Less, almost no distortion on Debbie's face. I've backed up a little bit. Instead of being probably about 18 inches away, now I'm probably 2.5, maybe 3 feet away. Here's 50 millimeters, so still a little more telephoto. Starting to look, I think, even more flattering in the way the lens renders Debbie's facial features, and this is true, I think, of most people. Then we'll go to 70 millimeters. Let's skip ahead, 93. I'm not sure why I picked 93. It's probably what I thought I was at 90, and it showed up at 93. And here's 135, the most telephoto on that lens. So let's look at this whole sequence. I think for most people, if you're just doing a kind of head and shoulders photo, they look best in that photo at the most telephoto. Facial features look for most people, most complimentary, most flattering. And the other benefit is the background, because your telephoto tends to be blurrier, and you also tend to include less of it. So look at that 18 millimeter photo. You can see part of my address. You can see all kinds of leaves and the wood of the pillar behind Debbie. It changes everything. And especially if you're trying to isolate a subject, telephoto tends to work better. Obviously, you've got different stories, different purposes here. A very tall building that I want to look straight up at, a wide-angle lens is perfect for that. A landscape that I want to show lots and lots of stuff, wide-angle is perfect for that. A head and shoulders photo, not so much. Not so much. So be aware of that as you're considering what lens to use, how close to stand to your subject, and how it will get rendered in the final image. So let's talk some more about lenses. And this time I want to talk about the different kinds of lenses. Aside from focal length, there's 2 basic categories of lenses. Dogs are going crazy outside. Kids are playing, dog is barking. Welcome to Summer in Sammamish. So 2 basic categories of lenses. The first one we'll talk about are called prime lenses. Prime lenses doesn't mean they're good lenses. It means they have a single focal length. So they will have a set, fixed, non-changing field of view. So they don't zoom. For example, I have one here. This is a 50 millimeter focal length. So this lens is 50 millimeters. So it sees a field of view that's kind of in that standard range that's going to pretty much mimic what it looks like, give or take a little bit, when I'm looking at it. So these kind of prime lenses tend to be smaller, not always, but they are often lighter also. There's less elements of glass inside and metal to hold it all. And they tend to be a little sharper, although this is less true now because computer-aided design and lens manufacturing has come a long, long way. So when we get to the next kind of lenses, we'll talk about the differences. And they tend to, these kind of lenses, here's their main advantage, is in addition to being smaller, they're also a lot smaller when they have large apertures. So they let a lot of light in. So they have this is an f2 lens. So this is a 50 millimeter f2. And f2 is a small number, which means it's a large opening. This lets a lot of light in a very compact package. Can't really do that as efficiently or in the same size with a zoom lens, okay? Which is the other kind of lens we're going to talk about in a minute. Zoom lenses are lenses that have variable focal lengths. So they don't just have one like this 50 millimeter. They will have, well, I'll do this one, several, a range of focal length. This is a 10 to 24, so it's wide angle pretty much the whole time, and it's an f4, so its maximum aperture is f4. Less light than this, smaller. It's a bigger number, so that means it's a smaller opening. Less light than that, but it's bigger. You can see it's already quite a bit larger. They tend to be larger and heavier, as I just mentioned, and oftentimes, especially on the less expensive zoom lenses, they will have a variable maximum aperture. Ugh, I know all these words, sorry. A variable maximum aperture, that is like the lens that's on this camera. This is the lens I use most of the time. I've probably taken about half of my photos with this lens. This is an 18, so it's wide angle, and then it zooms all the way out to 135. So anything I can pick between 18, wide angle, 135, telephoto, all the stuff in between. And you can see it gets bigger. So this is called an external zoom. The barrel zooms outside of the lens body. The variable aperture part means that when it's at 18 millimeters, the maximum aperture on this lens is 3.5. So still not as small a number, big an opening as this prime lens, which was f2. But when I get to the 135 millimeter end, this end, now that opening is even smaller. The maximum is 5.6 maximum opening. So quite a bit less light than this. So why do I carry it around all the time? Because it does a lot of the things I need, and for the value, when I first got this camera, this was the first lens I got. So it was the only lens I had, and because it was the lens I had, it was the lens that I used. So because it was the lens I used, it was the lens I got used to, and it's not perfect, but I learned to work around its imperfections, and that's true of all your photography gear in your life. Now, yeah, so let's talk about zoom lenses with a fixed constant aperture, maximum aperture, and that's like this lens. So let me take these two off so you can see what I'm talking about. So here's the big one. Here's the one I was just talking about, the 18 to 135. 18 to 135. On this side, this is 50, so standard, to 140 telephoto. 18 wide angle to 135 telephoto, everything in between. Why is this so much bigger even though it covers less range? It's also tons heavier. It's probably twice as heavy, but you can't see that in the video. Just trust me, my arm is getting tired already. Here's why it's so much larger, even though it covers less range, is because it lets a lot more light in. Its maximum aperture is 2.8, which is 2 clicks from 5.6. You got 4, and then you get to 2.8. So it lets a lot more light in, and it lets that light in constantly through 50 to 140 millimeters. I don't understand exactly how this works. I just know it's a more expensive, complicated, and technically more difficult way to make lenses. And the way the physics works is everything has to get larger to get to those large apertures. Okay, especially when you're doing zoom stuff. This little guy, f2, which lets in more light than this. Look how small it is. Okay, so this is only 50 millimeters. This is 50 to 140 and less light. So you're making compromises, choices about storytelling. With the choice of lenses you use, it's also a budget decision. This lens, I love it. Oh, it's my portrait lens. It's my Head and Shoulders portrait lens. I really love the way this lens looks. This lens is my walk around. It's all the photos I took in London. Well, 90% were taken with that. Some were taken with this wide angle, but these two lenses is what I had in London. And I love it. When I'm going on a wedding photo session, I will take this lens, the wide angle occasionally, and the lens that's on my video camera, a 16 to 156, 2.8. So I have to get two lenses to be fast enough, let enough light in to do what this one lens does. And they're both larger, heavier, and lots more expensive. But image quality is lovely, and they let a lot of light in, which at weddings you need because they tend to be in not bright places or at night. So I'm a zoom guy. I just thought I'd share that with you. I like zoom lenses. I only have two. My wife uses the other one mostly, a 35 millimeter prime lenses. I like it. I like the ability to have different storytelling options from the same spot if I want, or if I can still move obviously, but I have options from the same spot, which sometimes when you're doing events, which has been traditionally, less so now, a pretty big part of my photography professional business, you often are limited in where you can go. So having the ability to walk around with to stand in one spot with a zoom lens and tell different stories is kind of handy. Lots of people only use prime lenses. I have a photographer friend. I've got 3 lenses with me that are zoom lenses, all of them, and she has one lens that's a prime lens. And she takes amazing photos. She's learned how to work it, how to make it fit her style. And there's no one way to do this. Lenses are a fun investment. They're not a fun investment. They're a significant investment. And if you don't have the money to invest in that, then you get creative. Okay, this is all I can afford. I'm going to make it work, and there you go. That's awesome. Sometimes I enforce those limits on myself with not taking all my lenses, or I just don't want to carry them, and I'll just put this guy on and go see what I can do. And it's a lot of fun. Change is good. Try something different. But also figure out what you do like, what you're most comfortable with. Here's another practical element to zoom lenses. When I don't have to change lenses as often, I'm less likely to be clumsy, Michael, and drop one, which I've done before. It's not fun. It was broken, and I didn't replace it. I couldn't afford to replace it a number of years ago. Anyway, lenses. There we go. So lenses are another layer of tools you can use to tell stories. They literally determine what you see. And depending on what you can see and how you position the lens, you significantly affect the story. That's probably one of your most powerful tools for determining how interesting your resulting photo is where you put the camera, what lens you use. Interesting point of view is super powerful for storytelling. So that's a summary of lenses. They're kind of cool. They're addicting. They're expensive. They're awesome. They're fun. Yeah, so lenses, this will conclude lecture component for class part 2 of class number 6. Part 1 was the properties of light portion. As always with any of the lectures, if you have questions, please feel free to let me know by email. Stop by the old Zoom online office hours. That schedules on Canvas or in the emails I send out regularly to you. Another way to have conversation with me or other students in class is to join in the group conversation for this class. Ask questions about lenses, share advice, experiences, personal preferences. That's a great way to get to know other students by sharing or answering questions. All right, so we're going to end it here. I will see you in the next video when we get to class number 7. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful time creating photos. You stay well, you stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask, do all that good stuff we're doing these days. And until then, bye for now.